Once again, it's True Black Stories by Jason E. The Forgotten Massacre, Ocoee, 1920. It was Election Day in America, a day meant to celebrate democracy. But in the small town of Ocoee, Florida, democracy was met with bullets, fire, and blood. What happened here on November 2nd, 1920, was one of the worst racial massacres in U.S. history. Yet for decades, it was erased from the books. This is the story of the Ocoee Massacre. To understand the tragedy of Ocoee, we must first understand the time. The year was 1920. The Civil War had ended more than 50 years earlier, but racism was alive and thriving under Jim Crow laws. In the South, black citizens were systematically denied their rights, especially their right to vote. But this election was different. The black community had been mobilized. Groups like the NAACP encouraged African Americans to register to vote, despite the dangers. One man leading the charge in Ocoee was Mose Norman. Mose Norman was a prosperous black landowner and an advocate for voter rights. On November 2nd, he went to the polls to cast his vote. But what happened next would ignite one of the darkest nights in Florida's history. When Mose Norman arrived at the polling station, he was turned away. White election officials falsely claimed he hadn't paid his poll tax. Undeterred, he left but later returned, this time demanding his right to vote. This act of defiance enraged the white supremacists in town. Word quickly spread that black citizens were trying to vote. The Ku Klux Klan had already warned them not to. That night, a white mob gathered, ready for violence. The mob wanted Mose Norman. When they couldn't find him, they turned their wrath on another black leader, Julius July Perry. Dozens of armed white men stormed Perry's house. Inside, Perry and his family fought back, exchanging gunfire. But they were outnumbered. Perry was shot and captured. His fate was sealed. Perry was dragged to the streets of Orlando, beaten and lynched near the courthouse as a warning to other black citizens. His body was left hanging for all to see. After Perry's murder, the white mob turned its rage toward the entire black community. Armed men set homes ablaze, shot at innocent families, and lynched those who tried to escape. The once thriving black neighborhood of Ocoee was burned to the ground. Eyewitnesses reported between 30 and 60 black residents were killed, though some historians believe the number could be even higher. Survivors were forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Many survivors never spoke of that night. They were too afraid. The trauma was deep, and for decades their voices were silenced. Survivors fled to nearby towns, never to return. They lost their homes, businesses, and land. The town of Ocoee remained segregated for generations. Despite the horror, there were no arrests, no convictions. The event was deliberately erased from history. Ocoee remained an all-white town for decades, a so-called sundown town, where black people were warned to stay away after dark. For almost 100 years, the Ocoee Massacre was left out of history books. Schools did not teach it. Officials ignored it. But the descendants of the victims never forgot. For nearly a century, the Ocoee Massacre remained a buried secret. Survivors and their descendants lived with trauma, but no justice. It wasn't until recent years that the truth started to emerge. In 2020, the Florida government finally acknowledged the massacre, offering formal apologies and compensation to descendants of victims. Schools now teach this forgotten chapter of history, ensuring the tragedy of Ocoee is never erased again. My grandfather survived that night. He lost everything, but he never lost hope. Today we remember, we honor, and we demand justice. Efforts to preserve the memory of Ocoee continue today. Historians and activists fight to ensure that the voices of those lost are never silenced again. The Ocoee Massacre is a painful reminder of the cost of racial injustice, but remembering it is the first step toward healing. History, no matter how dark, must never be forgotten. Only by acknowledging the past can we build a better future. In memory of the lives lost in Ocoee, 1920.